Good morning, it's September 19th, and this is To My Liberal Friends. Well, I want to follow up on the national debt crisis that I talked about yesterday, that both candidates, and both parties for that matter, seem to want to ignore at our own peril. They ignore it because they have no real solutions and both want to spend money to appease their constituents. The national debt is now just over $35 trillion and shows no sign of slowing down. But you would never know it watching this campaign because nobody's talking about it. If you listen to both Democrats and Republicans, they act like budget deficits don't matter anymore. Both parties seem to think they can keep on increasing spending, cutting taxes indefinitely, and borrow money to close the gap and never have to pay the price. Well, they're both wrong. Why not make everyone happy by just eliminating taxes altogether and borrowing everything? The answer is pretty obvious. No prospective lender would believe they could be repaid in full. They would thus demand even higher rates of interest on debt. It'd become like junk bonds. Eventually, the merry-go-round would grind to a halt, triggering a crisis the likes of which this country's never faced. Now let's look at recent history. The last time the U.S. federal government had a budget surplus was in 2001. Federal debt held by the public stood at $3.3 trillion, about 33% of gross domestic product, and the government was on track to pay it off completely by the end of a decade. As I mentioned yesterday, it was a Republican Congress at that time that thought a balanced budget was important, and Bill Clinton finally acquiesced and cut spending. But over the next 2 decades, the combination of tax cuts, spending increases, costly wars, and the fiscal pressure of an aging population reversed this trend. The national debt held by the public is now over $35 trillion and over 100% of GDP. The 2024 budget deficit alone will be nearly $2 trillion, which is 7% of GDP. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2035, the debt held by the public will top $50 trillion and the total debt will equal 122% of GDP. As I said, neither candidate talks about the deficit because they and their parties are responsible for that debt. And let's face it, politicians love to spend money, but we're reaching a point where we can no longer ignore the debt we're saddling our future with. And just so you know, we don't have a revenue problem because the tax collections are actually at an all-time high. We have a spending problem. And before we leave the revenue side of the equation, as a Republican, I would allow the top rate to return to 39% in the tax bill that has to be written next year. This only affects income for a married couple over $731,000. That's not a lot of people. Then you have to decide what to do with that extra revenue. Well, 2 things I would do is increase the standard deduction, currently at $29,200 for a couple, to $35,000. This would benefit about 80 million tax filers, with the majority in the middle class. And second, I would increase the SALT, the state and local tax deduction, to $20,000 and keep it indexed. It should have been indexed in 2017, and it wasn't, and it now catches more people due to inflation. Then we have to look at spending. My first cut is the Department of Education. Created in 1980, it's always had a questionable function. Education is better managed at the state and local level without the federal government involvement and overreach. Prior to its creation, several of those functions were handled by other agencies, and they can be returned to them. The department got $90 billion, a 13.6% increase in 2024, and eliminating this department would save probably about $70 billion. Next, I would look at each individual department and agency and require them to make an 8% cut in spending for the next 4 years. Anyone that's worked around the federal government, as I did for 42 years, knows you can find those savings without looking too hard. Finally, we have to move to the controversial part of saving money. And I'm talking about the area that both candidates swear they will not touch, Social Security and Medicare. Right now, the government projects they will run out of money in the trust fund, so-called trust fund for Social Security, somewhere around 2031 or 2032. That date keeps moving as we keep spending more. We have to do something to reform it, but nobody has the political guts to do it. Now, I'm going to give you an outline of something that might help. You can get your benefits starting at age 62, and if you wait to age 70, like I did, you get your maximum benefit. It's about 8% a year. And so what I would do is I would change those ages and recognize that as a population, we live and work longer. I would make it 65 and 72, but I would phase those in over, say, a 7 or 8 year period, similar to what we did with the full retirement age. Acknowledge that people just are living longer. Second, now, of course, when you do that, Democrats will say you're making people work too long. The moment you do that, Currently, the FICA stands, I think, this year about $166,000 you're taxed your FICA. I would raise that immediately to $250,000 and keep it indexed as well. Now, Republicans will say, that's a tax increase. Well, yes, it is, but only upon people making over $166,000. And that's, again, not the majority of the population. So I'm going to do those things, get more money in, less money out. Now, there's some other things they're going to have to do, and Medicare is a much different animal. I don't have a real solution to that, but the fiscal challenge facing our elected leaders is getting greater and greater, and we need to make some changes. And if we don't, we're headed down toward bankruptcy sometime in about the next 10 years. It's been To My Liberal Friends. Thanks for listening.